Ihr wisst gar nicht, wie das deutsche Volk euch lieb gewonnen hat. Kleinen Ausschnitt ergibt uns, dass uns die Herzen so übervoll werden lässt. Das ist die Fanfare eines neuen Deutschlands, das sie hier ankündigt. Der Spaten ist ein Symbol einer neuen Gemeinschaft geworden. Und so erneuern wir denn auch jedes Jahr.
For more on the latest offensive overnight, Russia into Ukraine, I want to bring in former Weapons Inspector Scott Ritter, former U.S. Marine, who's been watching this very, very closely over the past 24 hours. And Scott, there's a couple of big moving pieces on this, right? We hear from NATO that looks like Bakhmut is about to fall. And also want to get your perspective on the use of the aircraft to hit these targets. That was something that you were wondering about for many, many months. When would we see the ramping up of aircraft be striking these targets? So first to Bakhmut, and this looks like it's about to fall. Do you agree with that assessment? And what does that portend for the rest of the war?
Well, I'm always hesitant when people say it's about to fall, especially something that's being defended as heavily as this is being defended. You know, President Zelensky's come out and contradicted everybody from Lloyd Austin to Zelensky and everybody in between, and said, no, Bakhmut is of strategic importance and that we are going to be doing everything we can to hold on to Bakhmut. And I think you're going to see the Ukrainians, sending some carefully hoarded reserves to Bakhmut to hold it, because as Zelensky said, if Bakhmut falls, it basically opens up the rest of the Donbass for Russian occupation, that Russia will begin rolling up the Ukrainian defenses, because Bakhmut was the Gordian knot that held this, extensively entrenched defensive line together, and the Soledar-Bakhmut complex. And when Bakhmut goes, there's a straight shot to Kramatorsk. You can roll up the left and right flanks, and Ukraine won't have the forces necessary to contain the Russians, and that'll begin the gradual unraveling of the Ukrainian defenses. This could be, the Kursk of this conflict. I mean, one of the more decisive battles or the decisive battle of this war. So, and if the Ukraine, and the other thing people need to understand is that, this isn't the United States versus Iraq. I'm not denigrating Iraqi manhood. I'm not, but the Iraqi army was not of the caliber. They couldn't stand toe-to-toe with the United States. The Ukrainians are extraordinarily brave, extraordinarily well-trained, and for the most part, extraordinarily well-led. They're very well-equipped. They're putting up a heck of a fight. It's not me that's saying this. Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, speaks in glowing terms about the quality of the Ukrainian soldier that his men face on the battlefield, and he calls them heroes. And the reason why I bring that up is that, when people hear, Bakhmut's getting ready to fall, it might create the image of a defeated enemy. The Ukrainians aren't defeated; they're fighting. They're fighting hard. The casualty level that they've taken is unreal, and the fact that they continue to throw themselves into this battle. The last time we saw a military that was able to absorb these casualties and continue to double down and press forward was during World War II with the Soviet Army, the Red Army, which suffered unbelievable casualties, but continued able to fight. The Ukrainians are suffering, proportionally speaking, casualties that are the equivalent of what the Soviets lost during World War II in a period of time. They've lost in a year what we lost, the United States lost in terms of combat casualties for all of World War II on both the Pacific and European fronts. So, in General Cavoli, the commander of U.S. forces and the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, recently said in a defense forum in Sweden that the scope and scale of the violence taking place on the battlefield today is beyond the imagination of NATO. NATO's not ready to fight this fight. Well, the Ukrainians are fighting this fight. And so I think even though Bakhmut might be ready to fall, it's only going to fall after much more hard fighting. It's a very difficult fight against a very capable and determined enemy. And it's not going to be easy. It's held out now since May, And it could hold out for another day, 2 days, 3 days, a week, depending on the tenacity and the dedication of the Ukrainian defender, which to date has been, of a very high level. So we'll see. But once it falls, I think Zelensky's right. I mean, the Ukrainians have overcommitted to the battlefield, to Bakhmut. They've suffered tremendous casualties. They've burned up their reserves. And when the battlefield ends, understand that when Bakhmut goes, you're taking a frontage and you're potentially ballooning it out. And the Russians have the forces to go into that balloon and fill the line. Ukrainians don't have the forces capable of containing that balloon. Right now, the Ukrainians are concentrated in Bakhmut, but if the Russians balloon out, Ukrainians won't have the forces capable of containing that. So you might see Ukrainians compelled to do withdrawals similar to what, if you remember back in September when the Russians withdrew from Kharkov, because they were ballooned out, they didn't have sufficient forces, Ukrainians penetrating, the Russians had to fall back on a more concentrated defense line. You could see this happening to the Ukrainians where they are going to be compelled to give up significant territory, probably in the north, to fall back on a defensive line that's shorter and able to be, be able to be held in a more comprehensive fashion. So I think Zelensky's 100% correct. If Bakhmut goes, I think you're going to see the rapid unraveling of the Ukrainian army in the Donbass region.
And then that, of course, means, as you talk about, what is left of the Ukrainian army at that point after Bakhmut? And you're seeing NATO allies ramping up the rhetoric about additional weapons, additional monies flowing into Ukraine. Marine Le Pen, former presidential candidate in France, over the past 24 hours saying, if we continue to send weapons into Ukraine, that this could wind up as 100 years war, with a continued dripping of weapons and money into this zone. So who will do the fighting? I mean, it would just be Polish forces, U.S. forces. Who's going to be Ukrainian forces? Who's going to be left to do the fighting there?
Well, with all due respect to Marine Le Pen, and I know where she's coming from, her heart's in the right place, but it won't matter. I mean, right now, the polls are bragging about how 10 of the 14 Leopard A4 tanks that were promised are now deployed into Ukraine. 10 tanks.
10 tanks.
10 tanks. It's nothing. Plus, in order to support those 10 tanks, the Polish have to build a logistics hub inclusive of a manufacturing capability for spare parts, because they don't make spare parts for the tanks anymore. So the complexity of supporting 10 tanks, the amount of resources that have to be put in to keep 10 tanks in the field is ridiculous. If France is going to provide Leclerc tanks? How many? 14? The same problem. How do you support that? It's a completely different support requirement than the Leopard A4. We're going to provide 31 M1 tanks at some point in time. Right now, we're talking 60 tanks. 60 tanks is not going to turn this into a 100-year war. The Ukrainians are losing manpower, equipment, organizational structure, etc., at a rate far greater than NATO could ever replenish it. But the big factor is artillery ammunition, 155 millimeter ammunition that Ukraine must have to be competitive on the battlefield, even in a losing cause. To hold the Russians back, to slow their rate of advance, Ukraine must have artillery, and they are going to run out of artillery ammunition sometime this summer, and NATO is unable to replenish it. And in a war that's defined largely by artillery, when you run out of artillery and the other side does not, you lose that war. So this will not be a 100-year war. This is going to be a 100-day war. I just think when Bakhmut falls, we're going to see the unraveling of the Ukrainian military position, and we're going to see the eventual destruction of the Ukrainian army in rapid order.
We talked about the aircraft, the deployment of the aircraft, and using these Karsal missiles, if we're pronouncing it correctly, and U.S. backed guided missiles also coming to the battlefield as well. What do you make of the offensive over the last 24 hours on the Russian side? From the Ukrainian side, they say 81 missiles, large attacks on multiple cities throughout Ukraine on energy infrastructure. Is this the beginning of a new offensive, a spring offensive, but using aircraft first to soften targets before before Bakhmut falls and infantry moves? Could you lay that out for us?
Sure. When we go back, if you remember in September, when the Russians began their mobilization in response to the Ukrainian offensive in Kharkov and continued on in the right bank of Kherson, Putin appointed a new commander of the Special Military Operations Zone of Operations. This was General Armageddon, General Surovikin, the bald-headed bear of a man. His job was to stabilize the front, and he did that, to prepare the front for eventual counterattack. But now that the Russians are getting ready to counterattack, they restructured the entire general staff. They did that a while ago. And General Surovikin went from being the commander of the Special Military Operation to being commander of the air component of the Special Military Operation, because the air war was going to become its own front. It was no longer operating in support of the operation. It was going to become its own strategic front with dedicated staffs, dedicated resources, etc. And what we've been seeing unfold over the course of the past several weeks is a very interesting military campaign. Everybody's been focused on Bakhmut, focused on the ground war, focused on the artillery. But there's been this really elaborate cat and mouse chess game being played between the Russians and the Ukrainians, and by extension NATO, that deals with Russia's ability to project air power, namely long-distance strikes, Caliber missiles, Iskander missiles, other air-delivered crude missiles, and the Exile missile, which is this newest one, the hypersonic missile. And now long-range drones too. The Iranian Shahed 136, Geranium-2 drones have played a very important role. The Ukrainians respond by bringing in new air defense and reorganizing air defense, creating an effort to create a layered, integrated air defense that could shoot down these Russian missiles or assets before they reach their targets. And so what we've been seeing over the course of the last month or so is this campaign it has escaped the attention of anybody who's not looking for it. The Russians are coming in with very innovative tactics designed to force the Ukrainians to activate their radars so that the radars can be identified and destroyed, force the Ukrainians to fire their specific missiles, especially from high-value resources like the IRIS-T or the NASAMS. Now the Patriot system is in Ukraine, allegedly. And then for the Russians then to target these and to denigrate, to degrade, to neutralize the Ukrainian air defense so that they can impose their will on this space. And last night we saw the Russians begin to impose their will. They struck repeatedly. They struck targets of high value, and they started using in large numbers the Exile missile. Before, the Exile was a one of. They fire one here, one there, because it's a very expensive missile, and the Russians didn't have a lot of them. But the Russians have been producing Exils. They're running triple shifts at the facilities to produce these things. And I think we're seeing these missiles starting to come out in quantities so that the Russians can integrate them. And the important thing about the Exile is no matter what NATO and Ukrainians do, you can't shoot it down. The missile cannot be shot down. So it can be used, for instance, to strike any target at once. And now notice there are 81 launches. 6 were Exile. So the Exile is still a small portion of the overall less than 10% of the overall strike force, but the targets it hits are guaranteed to be destroyed. So it can hit command and control targets. It can hit critical energy infrastructure that might otherwise be protected with air defense resources that would negate, a Caliber attack or a Shahed 136 attack or an Iskander attack. Well, you can't negate the Exile. It hits, it destroys, that's it. It can also start taking out the high-value air defense systems themselves. If you can identify a German IRIS-T or an American Patriot system or a NASAM system, take it out with the Exile. Bam, that's worth the expenditure. And I think you're going to see General Surovikin continue to shape this battle, allure the Ukrainians into activating radars to be destroyed, firing systems to be identified, and bringing to bear the hypersonic Exile when needed to eliminate high-value targets. This is the beginning of the air campaign, which is designed to collapse Ukraine as a modern nation state, and in doing so, collapse political support for the Zelensky government. This is an important part, not just of defeating the Ukrainian military on the battlefield, but of the denazification process that's going to have to take place, because there will not be a Zelensky government when this war is over. It must be removed. The question is, do you remove it by putting boots on the ground, trying to take Kiev, a city of multi-millions? No, you do it through this air campaign that we're seeing right now that's starting to collapse. And the fact that the Russians are starting to put the accelerator on the air campaign tells you that it's happening in concert with what they expect to be happening on the ground. You want to have this big offensive, this breakout. At the same time, you're putting maximum pressure on the Zelensky government. And hopefully it leads to a situation where Zelensky is removed from power. I mean, as a humanitarian, you would like he and his family to be put on an airplane or a train and flown into exile where they can live a comfortable life, forever condemned by the world for what they've done to the Ukrainian people. But realistically speaking, he's probably going to die. He's probably going to die at the hands of Ukrainians who are going to rise up against him, because he represents the total collapse of Ukrainian society that's taking place right now, not only because of what's happening on the front line, where hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men are being killed, but what's happening in Ukrainian society through this air campaign, where you're seeing tens of millions of Ukrainians displaced, critical infrastructure, over $1 trillion worth of infrastructure destroyed, and the nation itself starting to collapse. And it's a tragic situation all around.
Yeah, indeed. Well said, well said. Yeah, either he will die or he will show up in Hollywood in exile at Sean Penn's house with a new Netflix show, which seems probably pretty likely. That's going to be the next thing for Zelensky. Scott Ritter, thank you so much for talking about this. This big offensive, it seemed like it had all the hallmarks of something big beginning, and you confirmed what we were thinking here. So, as always, great to see you. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.